Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Singapore Injustice Podcast. I'm one of the co hosts, Kush, and this is Max, and today we're going to be taking a brief look into some of the injustices in Singapore for this series. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the fourth edition of the Singapore Injustice Podcast. It's actually been really crazy that we've been able to get this far so quickly. So, starting off, we ended last podcast about some job opportunities and racism in job opportunities, and Max had his anecdote about his mother facing, uh, I mean, it's not really discrimination. I don't want to use that, but
There was it was more of just disrespect, I'd say. Anyways,
Yeah.
moving on to this podcast. Podcast topic. Kush, what is the topic for this podcast?
So this podcast topic is about racism in job opportunities, depending on what ethnicity the interviewer is. So, in a survey conducted in 2016 of 2,000 Singaporeans, 53% indicated that racism is not an important problem in contemporary Singapore. However, more recent research has found that racial discrimination exists in Singapore in at least one key aspect: jobs. So, obviously, from that we see that the mainstream Singaporean doesn't really think that racism exists in Singapore.
And I don't think it does to that an extreme level,
Yeah,
but I think it does exist.
that's a good distinction to make, because if you're gonna go around thinking that racism isn't a thing and you're gonna live in this like place that's high up in the clouds, you are going to bubble yourself from the injustice in Singapore.
From the
Which is-
truth, from the harsh real world.
Exactly, and this is exactly what our podcast is meant to be for, because our environment in CIS is so heavily clouded from reality, and we don't face the injustice that the mainstream person faces in Singapore. So, continuing in the article, a study published in 2019, led by Dr. Peter Chu, senior lecturer of psychology at James Cook University, Singapore, looked at the effects of race on hiring decisions in a simulated hiring decision task. So, this is going to be the main part about racism in job opportunities, our entire podcast. So, let's get into it. A total of 171 Singaporean Chinese undergraduates were randomly assigned into one of the 9 groups and asked to review a resume of a job applicant. So, these undergraduates were put into place like interviewers. The resumes of the job applicants varied in academic qualifications, with 3 distinctions: strong, moderate, and weak academic qualifications, as well as race: white, Chinese, or Malay race. The participants were tasked with evaluating the warmth, competence, and qualifications of the candidates portrayed in the resumes, and then recommend a monthly salary for the job applicant. So there were 3 distinctions in academic success, so strong, moderate, and weak, and only races were different. So let's say there was a strong white job applicant and a strong Chinese job applicant. The only thing differing would be the race. Their academic qualifications would be the exact same. And through the study, Dr. Peter Chu found that that Chinese participants rated Malay applicants as less competent and less suitable for the job, and recommended a lower salary than equally qualified Chinese applicants. This effect was found regardless of the strength of academic qualifications. At the same time, Chinese participants rated white applicants as equally competent, more suitable for the job, and recommended a higher salary than equally qualified Chinese applicants. So we see this is actually called the Pinkerton syndrome, where you favor white people more than like locals, let's say. So it's really interesting that of the Chinese applicants, they discriminate negatively the Malay applicants, and using Chinese on Chinese as the main base. So Chinese interviewers placed white people above Chinese, Chinese in the middle, and Malay at the bottom in terms of the monthly salary that they should be receiving, which is really interesting.
And that is blatant racism.
Exactly.
And it is. It is. I think that it's blatant. It is clear and it is obvious. However, I do not think that it is explicit or like
Exactly.
I don't think people think, oh look, this guy's white, so he deserves more money. I
Yeah.
don't think that happens in the minds of people in this test. But what I do think is that happens is that subconsciously, when they read something like that, they do think about the race and they do subconsciously factor in the race.
And it's all subconscious, and which is exactly why 53% of the Singaporean population said that racism isn't a thing. It is a thing, it will always be a thing, and it will be subconscious. So
I think that's also fairly dangerous. If it's subconscious, people doing it, because normally, when someone is consciously saying something that is racist, they know that they're being racist, but they still do it anyways because they believe in what they're saying. But the problem exists when it's done unconsciously, and it's done because that's just maybe how it works. Quote. That's just maybe how the people are bred, fed up, or just like how people are brought up and raised. And I think that's a lot more dangerous than conscious racism, because I think that not only is it more prevalent, but I think that it affects more people. It's like cops in the U.S. Now I think that many cops don't think that they're racist, but subconsciously and without thinking about it, cops do have implicitly have racism against black people.
yeah,
And exactly that. Although that racism might not be like that is subconscious, still terrible, but subconscious, often subconscious, versus let's say the KKK that burns white crosses and literally lynches people. I think that's very conscious. Everyone in the KKK knows that they're racist, but I think that the unconscious version of racism is not only more widely spread, but it affects more people than the conscious version. Because I think that not only are the racial experiences that we both had, and most stories you hear unconscious, I think that causes them to be more impactful and more dangerous to society.
Yeah.
More painful.
And obviously, to understand this concept, I'm thinking of an analogy where you have a COVID patient, and one is asymptomatic and one is symptomatic. And if we call the asymptomatic COVID patients the subconscious racism, and the symptomatic COVID patient
The conscious.
yeah, and you see how
They can both spread just as much COVID, right?
yeah, but one is more easy to detect, and obviously
And therefore more dangerous. So like the symptomatic one, you get a fever, you get a cough, you get a runny nose, and you get a dry throat. You know that you're sick, therefore you self-isolate and go into quarantine. But for the asymptomatic one, in this, which is an analogy for the subconscious racism, so you don't know that, so you continue on doing it.
Yeah.
That's why often you hear people that claim to be very wise say that if you know that if you do something bad, or if you have a bad behavioral trait, it's most important to know that you have that, because then you can consciously you can't change what you don't know. If you're conscious of what you do, and in this case conscious of the racism, you can actively try to prevent that. I think that's very important to note also.
Yeah, and last podcast we talked about Sharon Liu, and that person was symptomatic COVID, like
Exactly.
conscious
He
racism.
He knew that what he was doing was racist.
And it's
but-
easy to prevent when you do that. Now, when someone has no symptoms of being a racist, but are subconsciously racist, especially in a place of power, where they're looking
Exactly,
at
for
job
example-
applicants.
For example,
yeah.
You see many companies that are sometimes very when it comes to the higher executive level. Singaporean companies, I think that you could say that This is I think this is my thought. I'm not 100% sure about this, but I think that often you can see in Singaporean companies that higher ups and execs are often Singaporean, and in like Western companies, executives and the quote higher ups in the company are often white males, and you see that pretty
Yeah.
often.
Exactly. So, relating to this, we actually have something that might help you see if you are having implicit connections and implicit racism. So, this isn't a cast opportunity per se, but it will be very, very helpful to better yourself, especially in terms of seeing whether you have subconscious racism. So, if you head on to implicitharvard.edu, we'll put this in the YouTube description, you can actually find some various tests about your implicit connections that you have. Like, if you go onto the website, you see Project Implicit, and there's a lot of situations where do you prefer a white person or a black person? Do you relate guns to violence? Like things like that. And
Things that implicitly
Yeah.
that don't explicitly test racism, because obviously people could control that if the questions were that explicit, but they pose questions that you could answer, not know you're being racist, but actually prove that you are actually being racist.
Yeah, so it's related to time where it asks you to sort two it asks you to sort black people and white people into two categories. So one is bad and one is good. And it gives you the pictures of a person, and it gives you words. And there's two columns, bad and good. If it gave you a word like harmful, you'd sort it into the bad. And if it gave you a person, it tells you where to sort it into. One round it'll tell you to put the black person with the bad words, and one round it'll tell you to put them with the good words. And obviously with that, there's some implicit racism that you can uncover, where sometimes, let's say you're favored towards black people, it'll be harder for you to put a black person in with the bad words in the bad column. So if you didn't really understand that, well, it's very easy to understand if you head on to Project Implicit at Harvard. It's a very, very interesting test, and it'll come very, very handy in the future and currently, where our society is becoming more and more woke in terms of
More and more
awakened.
awake awake
Relating
when
to-
relating to racism and other social injustices.
So now to get back into the Singapore context. So Chinese participants rated white applicants as more suitable for the job than Chinese applicants, Malay applicants less than Chinese applicants. So these results obviously show that Chinese participants discriminate against Malays and discriminate in favor of white applicants, which is the Pinkerton syndrome, which we briefly mentioned earlier. And to dive deeper into that, it's caused by mainly two factors. So the Pinkerton syndrome is caused by two factors: colonial mentality, which is a form of internalized oppression characterized by a perception of ethnic or cultural inferiority due to a history of colonization by Western powers. So once you think about history and you see how it was dominated by the Western powers, you feel this colonial mentality that the ethnicity of Western powers are stronger or more favorable than the others. And there's also colorism, the system that privileges the lighter skinned over the darker skinned people within a community of color. Okay, so next we're going to be talking about why Malay households, that these findings may help explain why Malay households have a significantly lower median monthly household income compared to Chinese and Indians in Singapore. So this subtle racism explains why Malay people in Singapore are slightly less well off than Chinese and Indians, to say in another words. So, Dr. Chu, the doctor that conducted this experiment, said that, quote, Singaporeans seem to be divided into two categories. The first category insists that racism is no longer an issue, whereas the second category acknowledges the presence of racism but is reluctant to talk about it. So there's two main categories. So we talked about the 53% in Singapore earlier in the podcast, where 53% insisted that racism is no longer, and Dr. Chu says that the other 47% acknowledges racism but does not want to talk about it. So he's saying that there's not a lot of people that actually want to talk about racism in Singapore. And that's really interesting, and that's mainly why we wanted to start this podcast. We're talking about the things that no one really wants to talk about in Singapore. Obviously, there has to be something to do about this, like something we can do to make racism not as prevalent in our society. So, what can we do? Dr. Chu says that the first step that we must take is to acknowledge that racism is still an issue.
That's what I said earlier.
Exactly.
It's like you need to know what you do wrong before you can fix what you do wrong.
And Dr. Chu also says that we need to have extensive discussions about it. We need to talk about it, be open about it. Racism is still a thing, and don't keep it to yourself. Don't internalize it.
I think that it should be. I know that in our international school, racism is covered a fair bit, and we do learn in school about its wrongs. But I think that generally, the whole population, regardless of age, ethnicity, or anything, it should. I think that everyone in Singapore should be educated, regardless of where you come from or how old you are. I think that like public initiatives that combat racism are still necessary, despite people. You said 53% of people not thinking that racism is a problem in Singapore.
Yeah. So to continue, he also suggests that Singapore could carry out something similar to what Australia has done to address the inequality between the indigenous and non-indigenous people. The government could release a 10-year plan complete with concrete goals, for example, to reduce the income disparity between Malays and other races by half within the next year to reduce racial disparities. So, we're thinking about a Singapore government plan that can make it so that society, obviously, we've been learning about how society and laws are different. As soon as you change a law to make racism disappear, like what were the laws that segregated?
Jim Crow.
Yeah,
Jim Crow laws.
Jim Crow laws. As soon as the government took away those laws, the society didn't immediately stop.
Exactly.
Yeah, there's still racism in America.
So, like, when it comes to social phenomenons like racism, I think that just because it's the rule or just because it's necessary, in many countries, in many political and governmental environments, that doesn't exactly mean that what that law is preventing is immediately eradicated from the society. However, I do for general countries like in the U.S., there's still racism now, even though that on paper there is no racism.
Exactly.
In law, there's no racism. However, I do think that in Singapore, it's a different story because, as we see, Singapore is able to because of the small nature of Singapore and the authoritative and controlling nature of the policing ideologies here. Singapore's more than any other country capable of actually combating racism, and if they made it illegal, and now they actually do something about it if it occurs. I think that Singapore is a special case in that matter, because not every country can afford to spend so many resources on simple cases of racism, regardless of how extreme they might be. Singapore is one of those other countries. I think that if Singapore were to make it illegal, which they have, that they could very effectively prevent racism more.
Yep, exactly. So Singapore, like obviously the people say that society's laws are much slower than our legislative laws, but in Singapore it's a lot different, obviously, as you said, because it's such a small country. You can basically call it a, like,
It's a city.
yeah, a big, it's not even a big city, is it? It's a small city.
Oh, it's a pretty big city. Singapore is like 5 million people or something.
Yeah, I mean, but population wise, yes. So it makes it a lot easier for Singapore to combat racism. Obviously, societal laws are going to be changing a lot quicker because there's just so much less people. So, James Cook University, the university that Dr. Chu, the conductor of the survey, this university remains committed to creating a better life for the communities. That means that they have been continuing to grow their education and research programs. I think CIS has been doing that too, especially these past couple years where social injustice is becoming more and more apparent. We've been seeing the increase of digital literacy and mindfulness. Like I remember I've been in CIS for 11 years now, and the beginning, like the things that we learn about, we didn't learn about these street skills, if you know what I mean, like
How
social
to-
injustice,
social
and
injustice,
yeah,
and how to
digital
prevent things
literacy.
like that. I think that now society's progressing into making social injustice and digital literacy education more prevalent in educational programs. For example, towards the end of last school year, we had a mindfulness seminar
Yeah,
that was mandatory, that everyone went to in the grade, and that, for example, taught us how to be mindful of not only ourselves and our own mental health, but also mindful of social injustices around us, and mindful of racism and digital literacy relating to it.
yeah, and it's becoming more and more common. Like I remember my brother, he finished his education 5 years ahead of me. So right now he's in university, and when he was in our 11th grade, I remember he never had these types of mindfulness or digital literacy lessons. Like it was taken for granted, sort of. But I see how it's really nice how schools have been incorporating uh, education and growth to better our community's lives in terms of racism. So, the university continues by saying that societies are better equipped to deal with change, emergencies, and the situations that make them vulnerable. So, the university has zero tolerance for those who seek to divide society based on differences in ethnicity, race, or religion, as does CIS, where in CIS, like, we take for granted the environment of CIS where we rarely face any sort of racism. Like, I've never faced anything
Me
in
neither.
CIS.
Me
Yeah,
But it's because of the international
yeah, this
nature
community.
of the community.
And normally,
Everyone's different, so there's no one group that you could pinpoint.
yeah, and normally you'd think that the type of nature where we see so much diversity, we would think that we would also experience racism, but that's just simply not the case, and that's the beauty of international schools. So we're reaching almost 25 minutes for this podcast.
Yes, and I
today.
think we'll round it up here. Today
Yeah.
we discussed racism in jobs
Yeah,
and race and subconscious and conscious racism, as well as we discussed some action opportunities regarding the Harvard Forum, and that'll be it for today. Kush, do you have anything else to add?
yeah. So just to end off, we really appreciate the people that are regular listeners to this podcast. Obviously, we might not be the most professional of people to be making podcasts, but it really is appreciated about the people that are taking their time to listen And even the people that are looking at our segments, it really means a lot to us, and we really hope that you are taking these CAS opportunities to heart, because CAS is really, really important for the IB, and it's just important for the community and our futures. Like, we really hope you take away what we say in these lessons. Like, we don't want to call it a lesson. Like, in these series, we really hope you take away these CAS opportunities and really attempt to use them. And obviously, these past two podcasts, we didn't really have CAS opportunities. We focused more on self-improvement and the findings of subconscious racism in this podcast. So to wrap it up, thank you so much to the listeners of the Singapore Injustice podcast. We really hope you enjoy, and we'll see you again in 2 weeks. And this will be our 4th episode, and we're going to be ending the series on the 6th episode. So stay tuned for that. Thank you.